Good afternoon and welcome to In Focus. I'm Juanita Tautungi. Today we're putting the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in focus. It's 6 months now into the hearings, with 7 being held in cities across Canada. So how far has it come since then? Is the controversy and criticism affecting its mandate? What do we know so far, and what do we still want to know? We want you to join in on our conversation. Our phone lines are open. Call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Use the hashtag MMIWG InFocus. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's set the scene. Yesterday was the second day of public hearings in Thunder Bay, and like Monday's hearings, more concerns over police investigations and heartbreak over families broken by violence, alcohol, and residential schools were heard. Willow Fiddler explains.
Lily Southwind had a gut feeling not to hand over pictures to police. Her mum Viola had been missing for 3 days when she reported it to provincial police in Sulikout.
I gave them reluctantly because we didn't have, they didn't have current, like a current picture of her to post, like to share in hopes of finding her. So I gave it to them. They said, I told them when I did give it to them, I said, I want these back. I want them back right away. And they said, yep, we'll give them back. We're just going to make copies. You can come and get them.
Southwind would get periodic updates from police about her mother's case, but they never returned her mother's photos, despite repeated trips to the detachment. She was told by police it's possible her mother's file ended up in the burn pile when the detachment moved into a new building.
And I just sat there and I was in shock. My first thought was, so when was it lost? How long has it been lost? All that time, when things could have been done or people could have been interviewed again, all that time it's gone. Like,
she was told the file that contained statements and interviews would have to be rebuilt with officer notes. The inquiry can access police files and documents related to cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it's not yet clear how many files or documents they will be able to attain.
We have lawyers that will prepare subpoena, I think we say in English, and making sure that Chief Commissioner will send and write those subpoena. In Quebec, it's another case. The lawyers can sign those subpoena. So we are requesting a document to the institutions. Some institution responded in favor of our demand.
Southwind said she wants to see a national task force on missing persons and something she calls a VIP protocol that would deploy immediate search efforts when someone is reported missing. VIP is also her mother's initials, Viola Isabella Panaches.
to me, it would be something in my mother's memory, in her honor.
And joining us now in studio is Hilda Anderson-Pryz. She is a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls liaison in northern Manitoba. She herself has lost a sister who died under suspicious circumstances. Thank you for coming in today, Hilda. And Kathleen Martens, she is a reporter here at APTN, one of our lead reporters on the topic, having covered public hearings, and continues to write stories for APTN on the inquiry. And she also has a connection with families. So thank you for coming in as well today, Kathleen. Hilda, let's start with you. Can you just talk a little bit more about your work, what you do, and your connection to the inquiry?
My role is I'm the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Liaison for the Manitoba Kiwatnik Okimakanak, which represents 30 Northern Manitoba First Nations. And I don't work for the National Inquiry. I'm part of the FILO units, the Family Information Liaison units, and I'm situated within MKO. And my role is to provide supports to family, whether they're like a family answers process, whether they're looking for answers from the police, the medical examiner's office, child welfare, whatever service provider there is out there that they're looking for either answers or resources to. I'm kind of the liaison, whole assistant, and advocate for them to get those different types of answers that they're looking for, or make those connections to like culturally appropriate healing services or counseling, whatever they may need. Yeah, so that's my role.
And have you been to any hearings yet?
Yes, I have been. I've been to the Winnipeg hearing when it was here in October, and I also traveled to Norrie House Cree Nation when they had, I guess the National Inquiry went there for a community visit just recently in November.
Okay. So what have you heard from families about this inquiry?
Well, like for myself, I fully support a national inquiry, but I don't currently support some of the, things that are happening within the national inquiry, because it's important for families to have that stability and that security, when they're doing their testimony, because many of them have waited like decades to tell their story, and it has to be a safe environment for them, and to ensure that there's those wraparound supports for families and survivors who are doing their testimony. And based on what I've seen, like many families, are re-traumatized and re-victimized through the current process of the national inquiry. And after they do their testimony, like even in Winnipeg, I've heard from several family members and survivors who have not been provided like aftercare supports, and that's critical because, to be re-traumatized, having to tell your story again, and then just to be left with basically your heart bleeding is wrong. Like the National Inquiry needs to step up and ensure that those adequate supports are there for families, because, a lot of them are experiencing depression, anxiety, some of them have medical issues with, when you layer on that anxiety and depression, it becomes harder to manage your, the medical issues that they're currently experiencing. So I feel that if, things don't change with, the way the National Inquiry is going, it's very difficult for families to feel, and survivors to feel, that they should be participating in this process, because how can you feel secure when, when there's 22 staff who've been either fired or who have resigned? From the outside looking in, it's very chaotic. And to have families looking at that, and survivors, like even myself as a family member, I haven't done testimony yet. If the National Inquiry comes to Thompson, that's when my family plans to do their testimony there. But even with myself, I'm thinking like, wow, this is like a crazy, chaotic process. And to other Canadians who are watching out there and watching what's happening, it doesn't even, give the rest of the Canadian population reassurance that this National Inquiry is a good thing. But I also feel that it could be a powerful tool, to educate the Canadian population and to build allies for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls when the public testimony is happening, to make Canadians recognize and realize what is happening to our women and girls. So there's good and bad points, like to the National Inquiry, but like if they could, fix everything that's happening internally and be open with their communication process, it would really make a huge difference to families and survivors. Because I personally, like since the National Inquiry has started, have not seen a work plan, and I've asked for it, and I know several other people have asked for it as well, and nobody has seen it yet. So, to me, it's like if you're moving forward, you should have a work plan that you've shared publicly, so everybody clearly understands, the process that's been laid out until the end of the National Inquiry.
Yeah, and I really wish that we did have somebody from the Commission joining us on the show this afternoon to answer some of those questions that you raised and the concerns. We did reach out to the Commission and invited them on to today's show. However, we haven't heard back from them to that request. You said a lot of good points. I want to go back to a couple of them and include Kathleen on this part of the discussion, because you mentioned aftercare, or the lack thereof in aftercare. And Kathleen, this isn't the first time that we've heard this issue of aftercare come up. What are your thoughts on that?
That's right. We heard it big time when 2 staff were fired. Well, 3 staff were fired, sort of one beginning October and then a couple more in November. They were frontline health managers for some major areas in Canada who dealt with families pretty much from the western border of Canada all the way across into Manitoba. That whole western half of Canada, these folks worked with families, and they said, there's no aftercare. They said it. That was the headlines the next day. That was shocking. We'd kind of heard that from families, but that exactly what Hilda was saying. People were giving this incredibly traumatic testimony, and then these workers were saying then we couldn't hook them up with anybody after. We only heard their side. We didn't hear from the inquiry because the inquiry said that's a personnel matter, we're not going to discuss it. So we are only going by what the fired employee said. I want to make that clear, but aftercare was supposed to be a huge part of this process. The fact that some of the staff said there wasn't money for that was pretty surprising, and we've actually heard Chief Commissioner Marion Buller bring that up recently, even this week in Thunder Bay, saying, or sorry, not this week in Thunder Bay, last week, saying that in Quebec, saying Health Canada, we asked them in the interim report, we asked Health Canada for funding, to step up funding to help counsel families. Which begs the question, okay, so why should Health Canada be paying for that? We weren't sure. They still haven't really answered why is that money not coming from the MMIWG budget. We thought aftercare would be part of the inquiry budget. Sounds like that's not how Commissioner Buller sees it. She sees that money for aftercare should come from Health Canada. Kind of some questions we need to have answered. She's actually going to be speaking in Ottawa tomorrow.
But how can you have families participate in a process when you don't have any aftercare aligned for them? That's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Do you think that families are not participating because of that? Has anybody said that?
I think families and survivors have different reasons why they choose to participate and why they choose not to participate. But, if you're doing your testimony and you're sharing, that trauma again and not having those supports, to me is a big risk factor, not only to your physical health, to your mental health as well, and for them not to be adequately prepared and putting the families through this testimony and survivors, what are they doing to families, leaving them in a state of trauma and re-victimizing them?
That's actually a very good way to describe it. There's been sort of there's 2 inquiries. It's there's when you watch the testimony, it's riveting. It's very educational for non-Indigenous Canadians to learn what these families have gone through. And then there's kind of the management part of it, the actual, where the people are being fired or resigning, and there's these 2 bodies, and they don't seem to work together, and we don't hear really what they're doing. It hasn't come together yet and worked cohesively. I don't know, that's kind of my observation lately.
Well, like I said, internally there's chaos. You can see it, everybody can see it across Canada. What organization has 22 people resign or be fired in basically a year, right? To me, that signifies that there's internal problems, big internal problems, and that need to be dealt with immediately, because you're dealing with a very vulnerable population when we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirited, and survivors as well. And if you're not prepared internally and you're bringing, like I said, a very vulnerable population in, and you're not providing those supports, you're just leaving them, like I keep saying, re-victimized and re-traumatized.
Kathleen, do we have any idea about why there's been so many people who have left or who have been told to leave the Commission?
Well, some the most of the people that have resigned have not talked about it. Some that were fired were very public, did speak to media, and said, you know, they were given. They weren't given any protocol. There weren't any procedures. They had to kind of fly by the seat of their pants, make this stuff up as they went along, try to write instructions or directions for themselves, weren't really given a budget, would kind of work with the family and say, I'm going to set you up for this, and then be told later, no, you can't do that. It sounds like communication inside was an issue, but again, we don't know for sure what happened because we haven't heard from the commission. It doesn't say what's going on inside. Certainly those are symptoms of problems. Like Hilda said, you lose 22 people out of any organization, that's going to leave a huge hole. I know some families' files have gone missing. I know that they were trying to get a meeting going on in northern Saskatchewan, the way Manitoba got the Norway House statement-taking session, and the person they were dealing with was let go. So then they had to go back to square one. So it's left even more gaps, created greater frustration, and I think keeps reinforcing the message that it's disorganized, and there's a lack of that creates a lack of confidence on the part of the Canadian public and families with the process, you know.
Well, we were talking earlier just about the schedule of the hearings and how they are, a lot of them are back to back. So I just wonder if there's just too much on their plate right now, if dealing with the hearings and dealing with internal staffing issues and just the commission trying to operate fully, if that's really a big challenge right now for them.
Well, the way I see it, you know, when they announced the national inquiry, to me, like going out the gate without having a solid foundation, to me, is a recipe for chaos. And not, like, to me, like, is 2 years an adequate amount of time? Because when you look at missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the survivor aspect of it, there's a lot of factors that come into play on why these things are happening. Like, we look at, you know, policing, like child welfare, like racism, you know, I could go on and on, the list could go on. And like I said, in order for it to be successful, I think they should have communicated effectively right from the beginning instead of not saying anything at all on what was going on. You know, like they could have easily said, okay, internally we're like establishing, you know, our staffing, we're opening our offices, we're doing this, we're doing that, and once all that is completed, you know, communicating that to families and survivors and the general public, it would have been like, to me, it would have been a different perspective rather than not saying anything at all, and the families are, you know, there's no calls being returned, they're trying to reach out and nobody's getting back to them, and creating that uncertainty right from the get-go, you know. But if they had open, honest, and transparent communication, I feel that things could have been a lot different for them.
So there's, I guess, a feeling with them going forward, we don't even know where they're going to be in January or February or March, and families don't even know when should I get ready to testify, to tell my story.
We have so much to talk about on this issue, and bring up some more of the points that you raised earlier, Hilda, but we do need to take a quick break. And before we go to our first break, here's a testimony clip from the Member 2 hearings of Natalie Glode and Becky Michelin. Glode spoke of her mother, residential schools activist Nora Bernard, who was killed by her grandson, and Michelin shared details of her mother's death at the hands of her father. Take a look.
Anyway, she hugged me so tight and she said, I'm going to put all my strength in you, Dose. She said, and she rubbed my back and she just held me. And then I went to the door and I said, I love you too, Mom. And that was the first time that was the last time I see my mom alive.
I remember being awakened by a loud bang. I remember after that, nothing could be heard in the dark, cold winter night over the cries of my siblings and I as we were to watch this tragedy unfold. I remember what she was wearing. I remember the blood that surrounded her long, curly hair. I remember shaking her with my tiny hands as I cried, "Wake up, Mom, wake up." But she wouldn't wake up.
Welcome back. Well, let's go to social media now and hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. We asked, do you feel the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls should continue? Duke writes in, as long as one woman or girl is missing, we need the inquiry. Oh, Peachy Miller writes in, no, reopen the cases, new investigations. Lyndon writes in, yes, I do. Everything must be done to get the families' voices heard and to get justice for these women. Nolene Villebrun tweets in, obviously they will continue. They have a contract to fulfill and submit, whether it is flawed. And Paul Grant writes in, yes, and if an extension is required, so be it. A lot that can be said on this week's topic, and our phone lines are still open. If you would like to join in and have your say, here's how. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page, follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, or call in toll free at 1-877-647-2786. All right, well, we do have a caller on the line. Let's get to her right away. Martha is it Manitoba, Martha?
That'll do. Actually, it's Alberta.
In Alberta. Thank you for that correction. How are you today, Martha?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Great. What would you like to say?
I would like to say that whenever anyone talks about a job, people at the head of their employers, they usually, when they love their job, are very open and delighted to speak about them. Not so with this inquiry that's going on. They're all quitting. Now, I don't need my PhD to know that there's something wrong at the very head of it. And the murdered and missing women that are gone are not being cherished. They're not being loved. They're not being looked after. And it is the inquiry itself that is messed up. And to be able to right the wrong that is going on for these women should be looked after with all seriousness, because it is so messed up that many of a good woman has quit working for them. And what does that say to the white community, that Indians can't handle their own missing and murdered women, and that Indian people are incompetent? No, that's not so. We across Canada are worried. We are scared to go out because there are so many that have gone missing. Even since the inquiry has started, there are multitudes of people all over Canada who have gone missing, men and women and young children who are being sold on ships in Ontario and the Great Lakes. Now, we need people at the head of this organization who have their heart in their right place. Get their heart out of their pocket where their money is and put their hearts where it belongs, where the murdered and missing women are, and for the people who work for them, and to keep hold of their employees, and to make sure that their executives are in line and doing their jobs. Otherwise, nothing will be done, and we will go on from January, February, March, April, and they will still be quitting their jobs. This is not right, and it starts at the top. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your call, Martha, and for sharing your thoughts. That, again, was Martha in Alberta. Now, we've heard quite a bit of emotional testimony from the inquiry. Here's what more families had to say during the hearings in Winnipeg back in October.
To this day, you know, our loved one was taken from us. We didn't even get to see our loved one for the last time. We didn't. They sealed that casket shut. We didn't even get to clothe her. We don't even know if she was wearing clothes when she was, you know, put in that casket. We never had that time we never had that opportunity. So all those opportunities were taken from us. So those walkers walked in our community, and one of the things to Roberta's casket, I vowed that Roberta's case would never go silent.
Her sister Jessica has a hard time coping still. And I too had a hard time at the beginning to cope. I did turn to drugs and alcohol. And there was a time when I wanted to take my own life after Sharice was gone. But my son Jordan, the one that passed, he was my rock, and he told me that I can't be like that. He said, Mom, you can't be selfish. What about us? And he took me out of that depression. Now he's gone.
That was hard to watch and hard to listen to. But Hilda, are these stories, stories when you hear them, how does that affect you in your role?
Well, it's difficult because, you know, you feel for the family, you feel their, you know, their heartbreak, and you want to do what you can, like in my role, and helping them in any way that I know how, or whatever resources are available to me, linking them up to those resources, because I know it's very difficult, you know, being personally impacted myself, and to, you know, understand what they're going through. Everybody goes through different things, but I think I have, you know, a pretty good level of understanding with the emotions and the pain you feel, you know, through your grief and loss. Okay.
Well, joining our conversation now is Lorelei Williams. She is an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and she is also affected by losing loved ones. Her aunt and cousin were both murdered, and she's joining us now from Vancouver. Welcome to the show, Lorelei.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you. What's your sense of the inquiry and the direction that it's going?
It's kind of upsetting. I understand why families want a reset. At the same time, you know, I've been to the National Inquiry. I went to 2 so far. I testified with a friend who's a survivor in 1, and then I was able to see the inquiry in Smithers. So I went to the first one, Whitehorse, and then Smithers. But, you know, you see all these people leaving the inquiry, people are being fired, resigning, and what does that say? It's not giving me hope, because it takes a long time to rehire those people back, and what happens to the work that they did, and how do they restart? So it's kind of frustrating to see, but I hope, you know, the families that are testifying, I hope they're being treated well. I know in my friend's case, she still has no aftercare, but I know in Smithers, I saw the AFOT team, so I'm grateful that that team is there with the families now. So.
And Lorelei, what have you been hearing from families about the inquiry?
I'm hearing a lot of things. I'm hearing good things, but I'm hearing bad things as well. So that's why I'm on the fence about this inquiry. You know, I really, really want it to be successful, but you know, when you hear both sides of the story, it breaks my heart. It really breaks my heart, you know, when families are not being accepted to testify, or, you know, you're seeing the media talk about lateral violence and all those kinds of things. And I always wondered what was really going on inside the inquiry and why these people were leaving or resigning. And, you know, when you see stuff about the lateral violence and lack of communication, that just says a lot about what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm. And staffing has been a consistent topic in our conversation so far. We've heard from some critics that the inquiry needs a reset. Even some have called for an overhaul of the commissioners. What are your thoughts?
Like I said before, I'm on the fence about this. I've met the commissioners. I have a lot of hope for them, but the way that it's going, I don't know. And I said it before, I see why the families want to reset. I get it, but at the same time, I'm scared that this is only what we've got, and we have to work with this. So, you know, I like Marion, I like Michelle, I like them all. I got to know them up in Whitehorse because I was at the first inquiry, and I got to have my answers, the questions to I had my questions answered when I was in Whitehorse, you know, but I had to be there, I had to see it, I had to talk to the staff, I had to talk to the commissioners, I had to be there in person, whereas other families aren't seeing this. And being somebody who doesn't know about this inquiry, who has never been involved in something like this, it looks pretty scary.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the aftercare for families who testify, or the lack thereof. What are your thoughts on aftercare?
Well, like I said, my friend, she still has no aftercare right now. She testified in Whitehorse. It was a last-minute thing that she didn't even know about. She didn't know she could even testify at the inquiry as a survivor. So just from the experience with her, she has no aftercare. And this was her first time testifying, first time actually opening up about what happened to her when her boyfriend stabbed her and then he killed himself. You know, this is a hard thing to do when you open up about something so horrible, so tragic that happened to you for the first time, and then to have no aftercare. That doesn't make any sense to me, but like I said before, they were working on it. They had that AFOT team in Smithers, and I don't know exactly what they're doing with that AFOT team, but I know they have the experience to work with the families, because I took that course as well, so I know they have that experience.
Did you mention that you yourself have testified at an inquiry?
I testified with my friend, not for my family yet. I'm waiting for them to come to Vancouver, but I testified with my friend who's a survivor in Whitehorse.
Okay.
Her incident happened here in Vancouver, but she happened to move to Whitehorse, so I was able to testify in the first inquiry with her. At first I thought I was just going as her support, but I realized, wait a second, I was fully involved, so I testified with her. And I didn't realize how hard it was on myself. You know, I was too busy being strong for her, but after we testified, I broke down. I broke down in tears. So it's really hard for the families to actually go through this, to actually make that first initial call, testifying, and afterwards, you know, this is a tragic thing. Like, when you talk about it, it hurts, it's painful, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is your hope for encouraging families to continue testifying despite these challenges?
What I want to encourage families to do is to reach out to somebody who's been involved in the inquiry or who knows about this process, because that's what I've been finding with the families that I work with. Some families have reached out to me and I told them what that initial first call is, because a lot of families freak out when they're going to make that first call. They don't have to tell their whole stories. That first call, the very first call that they make, they don't have to tell their whole stories, because they're going to have to retell it again to the lawyers, which is really hard. So I think families think that they have to tell their whole story right from the beginning, but no, they don't have to tell them. They just have to let them know who their family member is, and then wait for the lawyers and wait for the trauma team to be with them. So that first initial call is very scary. Don't be scared of it. find somebody who could sit with you, to be with you when you make that first call, and talk to somebody who's already testified or somebody who knows. Because I know when people are going to testify, some families, they've asked me what happens, what happens when you testify, and I've been able to tell them, because I've been able to testify myself with my friend who's a survivor, not for my family yet. So I know what to tell my family. I know what to tell them to expect. So.
All right, Lorelei, thank you so much for chatting with us this afternoon. I want to bring our in-studio guests into this part of the conversation. Hilda or Kathleen, do you have anything you want to add to what Lorelei's been saying?
Well, I think, you know, when we look at the national inquiry, like one grandmother shared with us as, you know, as a group, and she said, you know, we're never going to have another opportunity like this ever, you know, for our families to, and survivors to tell their story. And it has to be done right, in a good way and in a meaningful way. You know, otherwise, you know, what's the point of doing it if it's not going to be meaningful and create results, you know, for change at the end of all the testimony that families and survivors have shared. That's why it's critical that we get it right.
Kathleen?
Well, I wanted to say that families have been the consistent rock stars through what has been a really up and down process. They have showed up despite the dysfunction, all the problems. They have consistently showed up. They have sat down and they have given their testimony, and it has been riveting. It has, I think, saved this inquiry.
And I also wanted to add, like, there's a misconception out there. If there's a reset of the national inquiry, I know that there's a misunderstanding from some individuals who believe that, you know, who've already shared their testimony, that testimony would be lost, but that's not true. If there's a reset of the national inquiry, all the previous testimony from the families and survivors would still remain. It would just, you know, take a new shape, possibly like with new leadership, with new commissioners, you know, and sort of reforming the internal process on how things are going to go.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah,
Thank you
so
for
I just
adding
wanted
that.
to clarify that.
Okay.
Because there's a misconception out there.
All right. Well, let's go to another break, but I do want to thank Lorelei for joining us. Thanks again, Lorelei.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye-bye. We are going to go to one more break. We will continue our discussion about the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, so do stay with us. Welcome back. Well, hearing from the families is very important when talking about this. Now, on the final day of testimony in Saskatoon, commissioners heard from the family of 20-year-old Karina Wolf. Wolf went missing in 2010. Her body was found in 2015. Now, Jerry Constant eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Wolf's mother read part of her impact statement from the sentencing hearing during that hearing.
Jerry, what you did shattered my family, shattered me, my heart, my spirit, my soul. You took my only daughter and then left her like she was garbage. Garbage you threw in the ditch. Karina was not garbage. She was my only daughter. Each day that goes by is still a struggle.
All right, we want to continue this conversation and talk about the interim report that was released on November 1st. Kathleen, what do you remember most about this interim report?
Well, I kind of brought it for show and tell. It's quite large, and it compiled a lot of information, but there wasn't a lot of meat. You know, one page sort of had 10 recommendations, and out of those 10 recommendations, one was newsworthy, in our opinion, and that was asking for this national task force to open up a lot of the cases that we're hearing testimony about.
You mentioned show and tell.
Yeah.
Can you just hold it up?
Yeah,
and just,
for sure.
And just show our viewers Yeah, that's the interim report. And you mentioned it talked about the National Task Force was one of the recommendations.
Yeah, they asked for a task force to be formed with Indigenous police officers to reopen cases or review these cases that were here, that families are testifying about, that they're saying it wasn't investigated properly, or the conclusion, they disagree with the conclusion. Could this task force look at these files? Because the inquiry itself says, in its terms of reference, it can't reopen old cases.
That's right.
So it's saying, oh, could you start this national task force to do that? So that was one of 10 recommendations it made in the interim report to the Government of Canada.
And one of the things that I feel that, you know, the National Inquiry really missed an opportunity was to share put some of the families' testimony and what they were saying, and you know, some of the recommendations in here specifically from the families. Now we have to wait another year until the final report is released. So it would have been like, I felt it was a missed opportunity, because a lot of it is just regurgitated information from other reports and sort of talking about the National Inquiry process. But I think if you would have put some, you know, really key recommendations that were, you know, shared by families and survivors who participated in some of the hearings prior to this report coming out, it would have been much more powerful and meaningful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the timeline of this commission. The mandate is set to end in September of 2018. However, we have mentioned on news, and we do know that the commission is going to be asking for an extension from the federal government to continue on longer than that. Kathleen, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I checked with Minister Bennett's office today, and they still have not received a formal request for an extension. Now, we know they want it, so perhaps they just haven't had time, or it's in the works. The other thing we heard this week in Thunder Bay, which was new, is that we heard Commissioner Ailson say we'd like another 2 years. That we hadn't heard a time period. They had left it open, the extension. They haven't put a dollar figure either. Now, I know that we've interviewed the minister before, and she said she's open, certainly, to hearing from them on the reason for an extension, but she'd also like to see a detailed plan, which is what Hilda mentioned earlier. They don't want to just have an open-ended, here's more time and money.
I wonder if in the beginning, when they were talking about establishing this inquiry, did 2 years not seem like it was enough in the first place when coming up with its mandate, given the complexity of the issue and the places it had to go and the deliverables that needed to be done?
I felt that, you know, when it was announced that it was 2 years and the amount of money, I didn't feel that it was enough time or enough money, you know, to really address how complex the issue is. And you know, once families and survivors started participating and hearing about it, because we know as Indigenous people, once a few people participate, then more people, you know, will start joining and participating as well. So right from the onset, I said I can't see them completing the national inquiry in 2 years.
So you would support an extension, Hilda?
Yes, I would support an extension, but I also, like Kathleen said, it's very difficult when you don't even have a work plan that has never been shared publicly, or, you know, there's very little information being released from the national inquiry, the commissioners. In order to substantiate that extension, you need to show why you need an extension, and where the money is going, and, you know, where's the money being spent.
And a good segue to talking about this extension request is the hearings, the public hearings that the inquiry has been doing, is doing, and will be doing. Let's talk about some of those. And Kathleen, you've been to a hearing yourself. You've reported on them. We also know that 3 have been postponed. Can you elaborate on the hearings itself?
For sure. You know, the first one was in May. Started off with high hopes, and then there was a break taken for the summer. They gave a variety of reasons. So then they didn't start in earnest till September of 2017, and then it seemed kind of ambitious. 10 of them were scheduled. It's a big country. Then 3 were postponed. Now Thunder Bay was postponed in September. It's happening this week, so that left 2, and they were in the north, Yellowknife and Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. Now, the commissioners say, you know, we're going to get there. They've promised their schedule by the holidays. Let's hope people get it so they can prepare and be ready. Some people have to make travel arrangements and stuff like that. They want to know when is it going to be their turn, right?
And just speaking of the North, like I've been in discussions with not only the commissioners, but Debbie Reid, the executive director, as well, about having a hearing in Thompson, Manitoba, because it's never been done there. And I feel that people in northern Manitoba, like the survivors and the families and Two-Spirited, really need an opportunity to say to Canada, hey, you know, this is what's happening in northern Manitoba, and to share, you know, the lack of supports and services that, you know, that are needed in Manitoba. We need all these different resources there. It's many times I feel that the North is forgotten, like all supports are going to major urban centers, and the North is in, like, there's a lot of supports and services that are needed currently in the North. So we proposed a date like for, you know, the late part of February, early March to come to Thompson, but when I followed up with Debbie Reid recently, the executive director of the National Inquiry, she advised me that Thompson is in their draft schedule, and I've asked for them to confirm the date to me, but they haven't responded with confirming that they're definitely coming to Thompson.
And do we know, Kathleen, when they're going to Rankin Inlet or Yellowknife and Yellowknife?
Well, we have heard that January, potentially some a hotel space has been booked for January.
This is in Rankin, sorry?
In Rankin Inlet, yeah. So that gives hope to people who didn't want to see it leave Rankin, right? They want it in that community. That community reached out to the inquiry, said, please come here. When they lost it this month, they're quite upset, quite worried. You know, they are seeing that a lot of these hearings are being held in the south, major centers. People are traveling great distances to get there. That's not really fair. They want to make sure the North gets its shot too.
Right. And when we look at MMIWG and survivors, like we see, you know, a lot of women who've gone murdered or who have gone missing or who are survivors of, you know, different types of violence are coming from our First Nation communities to urban centers. So they need to start looking at, you know, reaching those communities who are not going to the hearings in urban centers to truly be representative of the Canadian population.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time for the show. I do want to leave our viewers and as well us leaving the studio today on, you know, feelings of hope for the inquiry, because we all had that feeling of hope when the inquiry started. So final thoughts from Hilda? I
think, you know, I'm very hopeful with the National Inquiry because it provides an opportunity, you know, for our stories as MMIWG families and survivors to be officially on record and to show, like, you know, it could help us when we're trying to lobby for other resources and support, saying this is happening across the country, not only in Manitoba, but we're like in Newfoundland or, you know, BC. We're all saying the same thing, like, and governments need to act to provide those supports and services to, you know, our most vulnerable population. And I feel that it'll, you know, create a lot of like empathy from the Canadian population, and will build allies as well from the public testimony.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And it's an opportunity, like, again, for families to, you know, become the voice of their loved one and share their story.
Yeah, I was going to say, like the TRC did, right? Yeah. After the success of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was tough work, just like this is. But the Canadian public at large learned so much about the residential school system, learned about the intergenerational effects, the impact of that trauma, and because of that sort of came around to understanding why reconciliation is important and what it means and how to put it into action. And that's exactly what this inquiry is supposed to do. So if you want to leave on a high note, hopefully they'll get that report in, or that ask in for the extension. They'll release a schedule, and that will, I think, allay a lot of tension and fear from families that, hey, they are going to come here, they are going to give us a shot.
And you can't, you know, just say, like, give a few weeks notice saying we're coming to an area and allow families to be proper, like families and survivors to be adequately prepared. You need to give them, like, sufficient notice, because, you know, to connect them with, you know, health support, legal, you know, in preparing for their testimony and finding who their supports are going to be. It's a big process, and it's not easy to do your testimony. So I highly recommend they give sufficient notice when they're going into different areas.
All right. Well, thank you both so much, Kathleen and Hilda. Our guests today, Hilda Anderson-Pryz and Lorelei Williams in Vancouver, and Kathleen Martens. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. If you'd like to see any of our previous shows, you can go to our website, aptnnews.ca. We're also available as a podcast, aptnnews.ca/infocus-podcast, if you would like to listen while you are on the go. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Juanita Tautungi.